Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval world, a place where half of everyday life was made up on the spot, and the other half was the result of someone forgetting to undo something they did 300 years earlier. You're about to discover how temporary solutions became permanent fixtures simply because medieval people had a dangerous habit. Once something worked once, they never questioned it again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval town crier was never intended to become a full-time profession. In theory, he was supposed to shout one message, just one. Something urgent like, "The mill is on fire," or "Please stop throwing rotten fish at the tax collector." After that, he'd fade quietly back into the background, as medieval people normally did. But medieval Europe had a fatal flaw. Almost nobody could read. A beautifully handwritten royal decree was basically decoration. The majority of the population looked at parchment the way a cow looks at a chessboard, with polite confusion. So towns improvised. They pointed at the loudest man they could find, handed him a bell, and said, "Just yell everything for us." Temporary, simple, practical. And that, my friends, is how a one-off emergency messenger became the medieval equivalent of a government-issued megaphone. The first time the crier made an announcement, people gathered immediately, not because they cared what he said, but because noise attracted medieval peasants the way glowing screens attract us today. Once the town realized how efficient this was, literacy programs vanished faster than a loaf of bread during famine. Suddenly, the crier was responsible for every piece of public information. New laws, market days, missing livestock, incoming merchants, suspicious weather events. Please boil your water unless you enjoy illness. He didn't just break news, he broke silence permanently. He'd march into the marketplace at sunrise, medieval rush hour, ring a bell loud enough to make infants reconsider being born, and shout, "Kyrie, Kyrie," which was medieval for "Attention, citizens. I am now ruining your morning." And people accepted it. They depended on it. The town crier was their news feed, Siri, emergency alert system, and neighborhood gossip rolled into one sleep-deprived human. Even when towns considered replacing him with posted notices, peasants protested. They didn't want to walk to a board. They didn't want to squint at uncomfortable scribbles. And they certainly didn't want to try reading while holding 12 potatoes and a chicken. So the temporary messenger got a uniform, a salary, legal authority, and job security so strong it could survive plagues, famines, and incompetent kings. Some families even turned it into a dynasty. Imagine inheriting the family business of being extremely loud. Historians debate whether the town crier system actually improved communication or simply created a culture dependent on being yelled at. What's certain is that medieval Europe discovered a truth still relevant today. Why read when a man with a bell can yell it at you? The position lasted for centuries, evolving only when newspapers finally arrived and people realized they could get bad news quietly in the comfort of their own homes without someone ringing a bell at dawn. In the end, the town crier stayed because medieval society built itself around him. Once the temporary became tradition, nobody remembered it was ever supposed to be temporary at all. The medieval world had a simple solution for losing things. Attach a bell to it. Livestock wandering off. Bell. Children wandering off. Bell. Nobles wanting everyone to know they existed. Absolutely a bell. Several, actually. It all started innocently enough. Farmers put bells on cows so they wouldn't disappear into the forest and start a new life. Simple, sensible, temporary, just a small hack to keep track of wandering beef. But medieval Europe had that dangerous habit we mentioned. Once something worked once, everyone adopted it immediately and never questioned it again. So bells spread like a medieval fashion virus. Soon goats had bells, sheep had bells, horses had bells. One chronicler even complains that he couldn't sleep because the night air did jingle most annoyingly. Congratulations, medieval farmers. You've invented the world's first unwanted notification system. Then someone, likely a very tired parent, said the fateful words, "What if we put a bell on the toddler?" And just like that, medieval childcare improved by 20%. You always knew where the small human was, or at least which direction the jingling was fading toward. The problem, of course, came when the toddler realized the bell made noise and began running simply to hear it ring, forcing the parent into medieval interval training. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, nobles got involved, and nobles ruin everything by making it fashionable. They started attaching decorative bells to cloaks, boots, belts, hats, horse harnesses, and in some cases, sleeves, because nothing says, "I'm important," like jingling every time you move your elbow. By the late medieval period, the wealthy had turned themselves into mobile wind chimes. Walking into court sounded like someone shaking a bag of coins. Fashionable? Maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere when you jingle like an overly dramatic house cat. And then came the jesters, who took bells to their logical conclusion. If one bell is good, 2 bells are better, 27 bells are perfection. Every time a jester moved, entire ecosystems fled the area. Birds stopped singing. Dogs howled in protest. Somewhere, a monk dropped his quill and muttered something uncharitable about the state of society. Over time, bells became so normalized that people forgot they were originally a temporary tracking device. They became tradition, part of daily life, part of the soundscape of medieval towns, right up there with shouting merchants, squawking geese, and one guy coughing ominously in the corner. Scholars still debate whether the widespread use of bells actually helped medieval society function or simply created unbearable noise pollution that everyone learned to ignore. What's remarkable is how quickly something practical transformed into something ceremonial. Bells weren't just tools anymore. They were symbols. A wealthy merchant's bells announced his status. A knight's horse bells declared his presence. Even church bells, originally meant to call people to prayer, became elaborate systems of communication, with different patterns signaling everything from weddings to fires to invasions. Bells stayed because medieval people discovered a truth modern parents deeply understand. If something moves and makes noise, at least you know where it is. The temporary solution became so permanent that even today, we still put bells on things, shop doors, bicycles, Christmas decorations. We've inherited a medieval hack and called it tradition, never quite remembering that it started with one frustrated farmer who just wanted to find his cow before dinner. Bread in medieval Europe wasn't just food. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, political propaganda, an economic indicator, and occasionally a blunt object. Bread ruled everything. So when famine hit, kings and city councils scrambled to impose temporary bread laws, quick fixes to stabilize prices, prevent riots, and make it look like the government was doing something besides hunting and arguing about taxes. These laws were supposed to be short-term emergency measures, just a few rules to get through a bad harvest. A little, don't charge people 12 chickens for a loaf kind of thing. Except medieval governments had the same weakness as modern ones. Once they make a law, they never remember to undo it. So the temporary bread laws stayed and became permanent fixtures of medieval life, whether people liked it or not. The most famous example is England's assize of bread and ale, a rule created during food shortages saying bakers could not overcharge, underweight, or otherwise scam desperate customers. Sensible, temporary, helpful. And then the government said, actually, let's keep this forever, until the end of time or until Britain invents supermarkets, whichever comes first. This single temporary law lasted over 600 years, far outliving the kings who wrote it, the bakers who hated it, and the peasants who pretended not to understand it. The law was so detailed it bordered on comedy. It regulated bread size, bread weight, bread price, what ingredients you could use, what ingredients you couldn't use, how drunk the ale merchant was allowed to be. Answer: not very. A baker could be fined, shamed, imprisoned, or thrown onto a medieval version of Yelp reviews if their loaf was even slightly too small. Forget burning down a village. That was practically negotiable. But selling a light loaf? Straight to jail. The bread police, yes, that was a real job. Patrolled markets weighing loaves like medieval personal trainers, checking for cheating. They carried official scales and an attitude that suggested they took bread very, very seriously. If your loaf came up short, you weren't just fined. You might be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle with the offending bread tied around your neck, a punishment historians delightfully call the baker's shame. The tragedy? The famine ended. The shortages ended. But the bread laws were still there, breathing heavily over bakers' shoulders like an overprotective grandmother. Medieval people accepted it because tradition is stronger than logic, and because bread riots were terrifying. Angry mobs armed with stale loaves were not to be underestimated. There's scholarly debate about whether these laws actually stabilized food prices or simply created a massive bureaucracy that employed bread inspectors who otherwise would have been unemployed. What's clear is that the laws became so embedded in daily life that removing them felt impossible. Bakers learned to work within the system, developing elaborate techniques to make their loaves look bigger than they were. Extra crust, strategic air pockets, creative shaping. It became a culinary arms race between bakers trying to maximize profit and inspectors trying to catch them. Some towns had such complex bread regulations that visiting merchants needed guides just to understand which loaves were legal. different cities had different standards. So a perfectly acceptable loaf in York might be criminal in London. The patchwork of temporary emergency laws had created a bread bureaucracy so tangled that nobody dared touch it. So a temporary regulation intended to stop chaos became one of Europe's longest-lasting, most micromanaging laws, all because nobody wanted to say, "Hey, do we still need this?" The medieval solution to crisis became a permanent institution, proving once again that nothing is more permanent than a temporary government program. Straw on tavern floors began as one of those charming medieval temporary ideas that should have lasted a single evening and then politely exited history. Some innkeeper, preparing for a feast or festival, scattered clean straw across the floor to absorb spilled ale, mask questionable smells, and give the place a rustic, cozy atmosphere. Guests loved it, or more accurately, they were too intoxicated to complain. The innkeeper woke up the next morning, surveyed the scene of destruction, and realized something miraculous. The straw had absorbed everything: the ale, the mud, the tears, the mysterious puddles that no one could identify. It was nature's medieval cleaning product. All he had to do was rake it up and replace it, a perfect short-term solution. But medieval innkeepers, being medieval, took this as a sign from heaven. If straw made cleanup easier once, why not always? Why not keep the floors permanently covered in something visitors couldn't see through, smell through, or judge too harshly? And so a temporary decoration became a lifestyle choice. Soon, travelers expected taverns to have straw on the floor. If you entered a medieval inn and saw bare wood, something was terribly wrong. Either you had wandered into a noble establishment where they frowned upon fun, or the place had been recently robbed and the straw stolen for warmth. Straw became part of the tavern identity, as essential as the bar, the ale, and at least one man in the corner who definitely wasn't sleeping, just resting his eyes for an extended period. Over time, the straw layer thickened. New straw was thrown on top of old straw. More drinks were spilled. More boots tracked in mud. More arguments ended in overturned tankards. Eventually, tavern floors developed geological layers, like an archaeological site, each stratum telling the story of last night's questionable decisions. You could theoretically dig through a tavern floor and date events by depth. The great ale shortage of 1347 was definitely somewhere near the bottom. The smell did not improve, but medieval people were trained professionals in ignoring smells. Their homes smelled like smoke, livestock, sweat, and occasionally despair. A little tavern straw odor didn't even register on their olfactory scale. Modern historians debate whether this practice was ingeniously practical or catastrophically unsanitary, though the answer is probably both. Even health inspectors in later centuries complained about tavern straw harboring fleas, spilled ale, and several life choices no broom could undo. But by then it was too late. Straw floors were tradition. You don't argue with tradition, especially not while standing in it. Tavern keepers developed elaborate philosophies about straw maintenance. Some insisted on weekly replacement. Others believed in the aging process, arguing that well-seasoned straw developed character, much like wine or cheese, though significantly less appetizing. There were fierce debates in tavern keeping circles about the best type of straw: wheat, barley, oat, each with passionate defenders. The practice was so ingrained that when wealthier establishments finally transitioned to proper floors in later centuries, regular customers complained. They missed the soft crunch underfoot, the way straw absorbed sound and created an intimate, acoustic environment. Without straw, the tavern felt too clean, too orderly, too much like a place where responsible decisions might be made. What started as a one-night aesthetic choice became a continental habit that lingered for centuries, all because someone once said, "Eh, just throw some straw on it." The temporary became permanent, the practical became traditional, and medieval tavern culture was never quite the same. Even today, some historical pubs recreate the experience, but with considerably more frequent cleaning and significantly less archaeological significance. Castle kitchens, in theory, were supposed to be carefully planned. After all, the kitchen was one of the most dangerous places in any medieval stronghold. Open flames, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, and cooks who had been awake since dawn plotting revenge against under-seasoned meat. You'd think castle architects would design these spaces with precision, but medieval reality was flexible, and flexibility is a polite word for chaos. Many castle kitchens began not with a blueprint, but with a crisis. Maybe the original kitchen burned down because medieval kitchens excelled at that. Maybe the castle was under siege and they needed to cook somewhere, anywhere that wasn't currently on fire. Maybe the Lord suddenly decided he needed a larger banquet hall for impressing guests, and the kitchen was rudely shoved aside like an unwanted stool. Whatever the reason, temporary kitchens popped up in the oddest places. A hallway? Sure. A spare chamber? Why not? A room directly next to the latrines? Absolutely disastrous, yet repeatedly chosen. The logic was always the same. We'll fix it later. Later never came. Once a temporary kitchen began functioning, castle life simply adapted around it. Servants memorized awkward new routes. Fire wardens prayed quietly. Architects pretended not to see what was happening, and cooks became experts in navigating spaces that defied every principle of human safety. Scholars still debate whether this improvisation showed medieval ingenuity or medieval incompetence, though most agree it was probably both happening simultaneously. In some castles, the temporary kitchen ended up nowhere near the dining hall. Servants had to carry trays of boiling stew across courtyards, down staircases, around defensive structures, and past livestock. A medieval obstacle course performed while holding soup. One misplaced step and dinner was canceled, and someone was healing for 3 months. The food arrived cold, of course, which is why medieval feasts featured so many dishes designed to be eaten at room temperature. It wasn't culinary preference. It was architectural necessity. Other makeshift kitchens had ceilings so low that tall cooks worked permanently hunched, giving future historians the impression that medieval cooks were a separate evolutionary branch. Some setups lacked chimneys, so smoke simply filled whatever room was sacrificed. You can imagine how fun that was during lunch rush. Cooks developed an impressive tolerance for smoke inhalation, though their life expectancy probably suffered. The position of head cook was prestigious, but came with respiratory consequences nobody discussed at job interviews. But the strangest ones were the kitchens wedged into gatehouses or next to the castle's main entrance. Nothing says, Welcome to my fortress, quite like being greeted by the smell of roasting meat and the loud swearing of overworked kitchen staff. Visitors would arrive expecting medieval grandeur and instead got a face full of steam and a cook shouting about burned pastries. Yet these placements stayed, sometimes for generations, because moving a functioning kitchen required admitting the original placement was a mistake, and medieval lords did not admit mistakes. Despite the chaos, people got used to it. Castle life flowed around these strange kitchen placements until they became accepted permanent features. The emergency improvisation solidified into architecture. Future generations inherited these bizarre layouts and simply assumed their ancestors had excellent reasons for building this way. They didn't. They were improvising and forgot to stop. And that truly is the medieval way. If it works today, that's good enough for the next 200 years. The temporary solution becomes the permanent structure. The quick fix becomes the family legacy. And somewhere, a cook is still carrying soup across a courtyard, wondering why the kitchen is in a different building than the dining hall, never knowing it was supposed to be temporary. So tonight, you've journeyed through a world where nothing temporary stayed temporary, where quick fixes became centuries-long traditions, and where medieval people discovered that the path of least resistance leads directly to permanent chaos. As you drift off, imagine the soft jingle of bells in the distance, the smell of bread being weighed by serious inspectors, and the crunch of straw beneath tired feet. Let these images blur together, fading like torchlight in a drafty castle corridor. The medieval world is settling into sleep, and so are you. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in history, someone made a temporary decision that's still affecting us today. And honestly, that's strangely comforting.